My life of crime was not short. It was fairly long, several years. And it was fairly sweet. It brings a smile to my face when I look back on it now. It did no harm to anyone. It did very little help to me, but I was in a state of considerable agitation to the point of a kind of helplessness, because I was, after all, only 11 or 12 years old. I knew that stealing was wrong, but if they had allowed me to buy Playboy magazine, I would have bought it. It was against the law in those days. It was against the code of disapproving adult supervision. The place I knew Playboy was easily available was Atwater's Supermarket at the Corners Community Center in Ithaca, New York. I think I stole 30 issues in a row. I worked out the day of the month the shipment arrived in the store. I think it was on a Wednesday, maybe the first Wednesday of the month. Not that I was unwilling to work for money to spend on things that I needed to buy, but this particular item that I yearned for wasn't available for sale to me as an eager but callow 11-year-old, and then 12-year-old, and then 13-year-old. I had a paper route. I delivered the Ithaca Journal, and my route took me to a place very near the community corners to pick up the bag full of papers, settle them in the front basket of my bicycle. It was not easy work. There were nasty dogs along the way. There were grouchy adults who complained if their paper was delivered late. It got a little rough when it was snowy and icy, but we never walked on our paper routes. We always used our bicycles, even in rough winter weather. So my technique for filching these Playboys from Atwater's store was on the first Wednesday, let's say, of the month, I would saunter into the store with my bag full of Ithaca journals slung over one shoulder. It was a cloth bag. There were a number of papers, like 75 papers in it. I would sidle over to the newspaper and magazine rack. I don't know if there were any newspapers there, but there were lots of magazines, an assortment of magazines. And I would settle down in a corner by the news rack and start looking through a good, wholesome magazine, like Look magazine, as if I were very interested in current events. We got all those sorts of magazines at home. We did not get Playboy magazine at home. All we had in my house was a kind of hodgepodge of a few serious photography magazines someone had bought. Who, I don't know, because no one in my family was interested in photography, and yet we had a number of photography magazines around with pictures of nude women that had been photographed by serious photographers of nude women. Photography magazine, modern photography, this title, that title. I perused them seriously myself. Everything was serious. If you wanted to be a serious photographer, you could photograph zebras or giraffes or nude women. Lots of men photographed nude women for some reason, presumably interesting shapes and aesthetics. Playboy had started about 10 years earlier. So it was still somewhat of a novelty in my Protestant world. I was about the same age as Playboy. When the first issue came out with Marilyn Monroe on the cover, I was squalling from my bassinet, presumably. We didn't worry about Playboy magazine when I was an infant. We never discussed it when I was a pubescent child. We never discussed much of anything having to do with sexuality in my family. One time I did ask my mother, when I was maybe 13. I said, "Mom, what is sex like?" And she said, "It feels very good." That's all she said. That was the totality of my sex education. Hearing from my mother that it felt good. She didn't say it was sinful. She didn't say that some aspects of it, as the Boy Scouts taught me, were self-abuse. The Boy Scouts told me to guard against self-abuse. It said that in our Wolf Pack guidebook for Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts or something. One of these paramilitary little booklets we were given said you were supposed to be totally honest and saintly and avoid self-abuse at all costs. I had no idea what self-abuse was. The word masturbation had never crossed the lips that I was familiar with of any person in our household. I wouldn't have known what that was either. I didn't learn what masturbation was until I learned what, at least conventionally speaking among us white bread Presbyterians, sex was. Penetration, male, female, all of that kind of thing that we Mosers never talked about. As hard as this is to understand today, these 30 issues of Playboy magazine I ogled in privacy never once tempted me to abuse myself. I hesitate to use the word masturbate, but I didn't use it in those days and I didn't do it. I was pure and stupid. I did nothing for my own pleasure except I looked at the photos of these almost nude women in Playboy magazine. 1961, 62, that golden era when John F. Kennedy was president, and let it be known that his favorite reading was James Bond novels by Ian Fleming. So all us kids, all us boys in junior high, we read the James Bond novels. And they were full of sort of quasi-sex, too. Nothing was real in those days, and the photos in Playboy weren't real either. They weren't sex. They were, curiously, a kind of anti-sex. They were airbrushed photos so that these things like clitoris or pudenda, forget about it. Those were not to be learned about in these pictures. All we could see in those pictures was breasts of women. The whole thing was rather a babyish view of sexuality. I'm sorry, Hugh Hefner, but that's the way it was. It was like a great mammalian feast for big male babies. So I had sidled over to the newsstand at Atwater's. I would take a large format magazine. Look magazine was good, Life magazine was good. Time magazine actually was not so good because it was roughly the same dimensions as Playboy. But I would take a big scale magazine and be studying it seriously and would overlay it against the shelf where the Playboys were kept. The new consignment of Playboys that had just that day arrived. And I'd have my Look magazine on top of the Playboy. Then I would lift it in such a way that the Playboy was underneath the Look magazine. I would put them all on my bag of newspapers and keep looking through this Look magazine, learning maybe about John F. Kennedy himself, our vibrant young president. We didn't know he was running around with hussies around the White House pool yet. That only came many years later. And then underneath, I would, with my other hand, slip the Playboy magazine in among my innocent bundle of Ithaca journals. I would feel underneath the Look magazine, make sure that the Playboy was concealed among the Ithaca journals. And then I would casually, everything casual, put the Look magazine back. Meantime, I was fully aware that the office of the manager of the Atwater supermarket was immediately upstairs from where I sat, and there were glass windows from which the manager could look out on the store and keep track of customers, keep track of merchandise. But this 11-year-old boy down there, this spindly boy with his sack of newspapers, snuck by the watchful look, month after month after month, every first Wednesday. But what interests me most now, looking back on this, isn't my technique, isn't really my motivation even, that's pretty obvious. But it's what I did with the Playboy magazine immediately on leaving Atwater's supermarket, with a considerable feeling of relief, but still some tension, because I didn't know if someone might not be following me out the door at a discreet distance, and then the heavy arm of adult disapproval might land on my shoulder and say, "Son, you have sinned." Basically, that's what he was going to say. And the result for me would be trouble, big T, trouble at 118 North Sunset Drive, and maybe well beyond. What happened to boys who stole Playboy magazine? I didn't want to find out. I never had to find out because I never did feel that hard hand of the law on my shoulder. Maybe I should have. Maybe I'd have been better off if I had. I'm sure our pastor, Walter Dodds, down at the Presbyterian Church would have, well, I don't know what Walter Dodds would have said. I don't know what my own father would have said. I had a box at home. Now, this again had to do with Boy Scouts. At some stage of Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts, we had to build an ornamental box of some sort. And I knew just what I wanted to build. It was a box in which to store my Sports Illustrated magazines. I liked following sports. I read these issues cover to cover. And I built this out of light plywood. It had a hinge, I think, of leather. And I wrote Sports Illustrated on the top wooden cover of the box that I made in a script that very closely resembled the title of the magazine. The magazines fit quite neatly inside. And as it happened, Sports Illustrated had exactly the dimensions of Playboy magazine. So what the use of this box was, really, although the Boy Scouts didn't know it, and my family didn't seem to know it, never confronted me about it, was my receptacle for the current and most recent issues of Playboy, with, on top of these copies of Playboy, 2 or 3 slim copies of Sports Illustrated. Long before Sports Illustrated itself went raunchy with photos of almost nude women. What is it with our culture that we need to tease ourselves this way? Very interesting and a little bit distressing, but that's a topic for an entire different essay, a serious essay into which I won't go right now because I'm not so interested in being serious. Hugh Hefner, the editor and founder of Playboy magazine, was very interested in seeming to be serious. One thing that he had going in his magazine, month after month after month in this period, exactly this period, when I was dutifully reading through the pages of Playboy, was the Playboy philosophy in one chapter after another. And they were long chapters. They were super serious. And it went on and on and on. And it was so much guff because all this was, for the adults who subscribed, was a self-abuse magazine. To call it a jack-off magazine would be putting it a little crudely and would sound a little raw. That's why I prefer the term self-abuse, for the very same reason the grand poobahs of the Boy Scouts always preferred the term self-abuse, for that nasty business that in my youth was reputed to grow hair on the palms of your hands if you did it. Because as a term, self-abuse was kind of nice, a euphemism, and no one knew what it meant. At least I didn't. When I would leave Atwater's store with this freshly filched copy of the magazine in my bag of Ithaca journals, I would speed to one destination, always, called East Upland. This road led south from Atwater Supermarket and then crested a small rise and then swooped down to Triphammer Road below. But just at that crest, there was a path that led off into this dark place with the sweet scent of pine needles and the shade of these sheltering trees. It was completely secret. I didn't feel like anyone would discover me there. There's all sorts of Freudian possibilities in this, where I'd go into this dark, maybe slightly damp bit of woods, lean my bike against a tree. I would almost ceremoniously remove this fresh Playboy magazine from my bundle of Ithaca journals, and as if to verify that the magazine was authentic, that it was the real thing and not some terrible, bogus imitation, I would open it up, close my eyes, and press the crotch of this magazine, the opening of the magazine, to my face and breathe deeply. The wonderful scent of the particular kind of expensive photographic paper they printed Playboy magazine on. That was as sexual as it got for me. Later on, I would leaf through the pages, I would look at the centerfold, I would dutifully read these clever jokes that had little pixies among the jokes. The assumption seemed to be that the goal we were after as American males was to become a playboy. It was consumerism. You'd buy this fancy hi-fi, you'd buy a fancy car, you'd buy fancy clothes, fancy duds. They would have style issues in the magazine. They'd have articles on cool jazz, all these sorts of things, because that was the goal, to make it to the pinnacle of consumerism in American life. And the assumption seemed to be that going with all these things were these perfectly bodied bunnies. That was another accessory to the perfect male. You would get this rubbery sort of woman because she didn't have sex parts. That was all glossed over, airbrushed out. The disrobing of the mystery was never done. It was the bunny that you wanted. And Hugh Hefner had these places that the playboy could retire to attain these bunny women. Playboy mansions in various cities, mainly in Chicago and in LA. Those were his big places, wearing his special smoking jacket or his pajamas or a combination of them with bunnies all around. And he'd be puffing his pipe and drinking, I think he drank Diet Coke. I was allowed to buy Coke at Atwater's. If I could have bought Playboy magazine, I suppose I would have used some of my paperboy earnings to buy a few issues, and then I probably would have lost interest. At the age of 15, I found, to my astonishment, that in Europe, they didn't forbid the purchase of Playboy magazine to teenage boys, pubescent boys, any boys who had the funds to buy the magazine. And it was expensive in Europe. It was double the price in the States, but I didn't care. If I forked over the money for an issue of Playboy in Paris or in Geneva or someplace, they would sell it to me. It was the same issue I'd filched in Ithaca, but it didn't have nearly the pleasure. And I soon ran out of interest in it. Why be interested in airbrushed sexual parts and in phony philosophy when you could read real books? Now, we did have in our house Along with these issues of photography today, or whatever it was, modern photography, inexplicably there was a copy of Fanny Hill. And you can be sure I read plenty of that, and I was introduced to new terms to go along with self-abuse from the Boy Scouts. They also were euphemistic, it seemed to me. I die, she cried. I spend. What's she spending? I had no idea. Spending. And quim was a word that came up a lot. That was a sex part of a woman, somehow. Quim. I've tried using that in Scrabble in the years since, and I've met with nasty reactions, mostly from women. It should be in Scrabble a way of unloading the queue, but doesn't seem allowed. Not in any Scrabble dictionary for polite, decent folk. Another interesting word in Fanny Hill was the word member. He took his male member, which always was of gargantuan proportions, and he did various things with his male member. Females didn't have members. It was only males who had members. I'd always thought that you were a member of the Boy Scouts or something when you were trying hard not to abuse yourself, whatever that meant. Now, when I bought these copies of Playboy in Europe, I wasn't so much interested in the scent of the paper anymore because I didn't have a pine forest to hide in, to luxuriate in its wonderful smell. I never again attained that moment of Eden, really. It was a paradise, I found, for a 12-year-old, for a 13-year-old. It wasn't in looking at the magazine. It was in having the magazine. It wasn't in stealing the magazine, really, that I got my pleasure. That was a hurdle I had to overcome to have my moment of pleasure there in the pine woods. My eyes closed, smelling that wonderful sexual scent, which was all I knew of sex as a 12-year-old in 1961, with John F. Kennedy, our handsome young president, doing no wrong in the White House.